In the 1970s, stepping into a Formula One car was much like playing roulette with your life. They were literal death traps. Funnily enough, when Formula One started back in the 50s, it was actually much safer. The teams had fewer people, the tracks were mostly abandoned airfields, and with a few hay bales for barriers, and the only real engineering aspect involved was how powerful they could make the engine, which was only about 300 horsepower at the time. But as the years went by, everything got a lot more advanced, and the level of competition reached an all-time high. Teams found themselves pushing harder than ever to find small improvements in areas like suspension, materials, and aerodynamics. More on that later, which often come with a complete disregard for safety. So when the 50s and 60s came and went, we were left with extremely fast cars with basically no safety features whatsoever. I'll be talking a bit more about the 50s and 60s shortly, but for now, let's focus on the absolute insanity of Formula One in the 1970s. To help you understand just how insane 1970s F1 was, I want to show you a couple of the wildest crashes first so you can see just what we're dealing with. Viewer discretion is advised. The first crash I just showed was from the 1973 British Grand Prix, which saw one of the biggest pile-ups ever, involving 8 cars after Jody Scheckter spun on the straight. These cars weren't known for taking impacts well, let alone huge side impacts, so imagine how ridiculously painful and terrifying these would have been from inside the cockpit. And of course, Niki Lauda's crash in 1976 became one of, if not the most famous crash of all time. The aftermath of what looked like a pretty tame impact with the barrier was shocking. His Ferrari broke up and caught fire immediately, highlighting the complete lack of safety inherent in these machines. And these were just 4 accidents where the drivers survived. Can you imagine how horrific the 12 fatal crashes really were? So how did F1 get to this point in the first place? Well, looking back, we often wonder how the races were allowed to take place at all. I mean, who thought it would be a good idea to drive around at 200 miles per hour, sitting between 2 fuel tanks in a tin can? It's hard to believe it now, but that's exactly what they were doing. The 70s allowed for a huge amount of technical freedom, from engines to aerodynamics, chassis, and suspensions. This produced some of the most iconic cars in F1 history, like the bonkers 6-wheel Tyrrell P34, or the downforce deranged Brabham BT46B. The FIA wouldn't be a big fan of that today. Anyway, as cool as these cars were, they weren't always the most reliable, and definitely not the safest. Crashes were common, and usually catastrophic. In total, the 1970s saw 12 driver deaths. To put that into perspective, in the last 30 years, we've thankfully only had 3 deaths, and 2 of those happened during that horrible weekend in 1994.
Roland Ratzenberger succumbed to injuries sustained in the accident which took place at Imola Circuit during Saturday qualifying practice, April the 30th.
But a spokesman for the hospital in Bologna said there was no chance he would survive. 2 drivers killed in 24 hours. Where does this leave Formula One racing?
While the 50s and 60s weren't exactly incident-free either, it was the 1970s that made everyone realize that it was getting severely out of hand. The safety was far behind where it needed to be in so many areas, and to make matters worse, the cars were only getting faster and faster each season. It simply couldn't continue. So let's take a look at what finally made the world stand up, take notice, and start implementing improvements. In 1950 in Monaco, pole position was set by Juan Manuel Fangio with a time of 150.2. In 1970, at the same track, Jackie Stewart set a 124 dead. That's 26 seconds faster around the same track in just 20 years. Of course, teams could improve their cars so much quicker than they can today, because they had so much more to learn and so few regulations. I mean, back then, the extent of their knowledge in aerodynamics ended at thinking the car should be narrow and pointy to cut through the air. Who needs downforce anyway? Like Enzo Ferrari said in 1960.
Aerodynamics are for people who can't build engines.
He may have been il commendatore, but his command over front and rear wings wasn't what you'd call strong. Even back then, this was a pretty ridiculous statement. Many other teams disagreed with Enzo and started working more and more on the aerodynamic aspects of racing, and very soon, a revolution would be born. Things began to change fast when teams started adding downforce to cars. It was led by the legendary Colin Chapman, who went to Monaco in 1968 with the Lotus 49B that he had designed. The other teams were shocked when they realized how much effort he had put into it. It had two small front wings and a very small ducktail rear wing. This of course gave an increase in downforce, something that comes in handy around Monaco, and made the car much more stable than its rivals. I won't go into all the details so you don't fall asleep, but to put it very simply, from that day forward, aerodynamics was at the forefront of everyone's mind, and Colin's ideas changed F1 forever. So by the time the 70s rolled around, everyone was piling on downforce left, right and center, and in return, the cars got a whole lot faster than they were just 5 years before. However, this caused a bit of a problem. Nowadays, of course, drivers start karting when they're as young as 3 or 4 years old and use their early years to build up to faster and faster machinery. This sort of preparation is key if you aim to handle the craziest cars on the planet, but back then, it wasn't unheard of for drivers to hop into cars for the first time a lot later in life. I'm talking about a lot later. American driver George Follmer is the oldest rookie in the past 50 years, after making his debut at a staggering 39 years of age. To be precise, he was 39 years, 1 month and 4 days old when he made his debut at the South African Grand Prix for Arrows in '73. The wildest thing is that a lot of the drivers from the 70s didn't even have that much experience racing any cars, let alone F1 cars. Imagine hitting nearly 190 miles per hour when you've only driven a touring car a few times in your life. I mean, it was just ludicrous. So it doesn't take a genius to predict how that would turn out for a lot of them. One of the main reasons today's F1 cars are so big and heavy, the current minimum weight is 798 kilograms by the way, is because of safety. They have to be bigger to accommodate the materials and crash structures needed to meet the regulations. But in the 70s, safety wasn't anywhere near the top priority of the list when the cars were designed. To be honest, they didn't really care at all. This meant that the Lotus 72, which Jochen Rindt won the 1970 title with, weighed just under 540 kilograms, and that's with all its liquids on board, which would have weighed about 50 kilograms. It was also a car that was seen as a revelation, adding a lot more downforce with its higher angled rear wing, so it's not hard to see why they broke into a million bits when they had any sort of crash, or straight up didn't protect the driver, as we saw with Jochen's fatal accident in the Lotus 72's very first season.
In the name of the Father.
To be honest, I'm surprised they were wearing helmets considering the survival cell wasn't even mandatory until 1981, meaning the cockpit was just a seat surrounded by a thin sheet of metal. As well as that, carbon fiber wasn't introduced till 1980, so the cars were incredibly weak and incredibly light. So if the cars were basically death traps, even after decades of having the chance to make improvements, did it even matter what drivers wore whilst driving them? Drivers' overalls didn't even have to be fireproof until 1975, when the FIA figured it could be a good idea in case your 200-mile-per-hour bomb detonates with you sitting in it. In 1973, one of the most horrific deaths in all of Formula One history occurred at the Dutch Grand Prix. Roger Williams suffered a tyre failure at high speed and hit the barrier, flipping his car over and catching fire. He wasn't seriously injured, but he was trapped under his burning car and had no chance of getting out. Another driver, David Purley, stopped on track to try and help Williamson by flipping his car onto its wheels, but he wasn't able to either. He grabbed the only fire extinguisher in the area from the marshals and tried putting out the fire, but this was no use. The marshals weren't even wearing fireproof clothing, so they couldn't even help. Instead, they just stood and watched a man burn to death for over 5 minutes. In my opinion, it was the most disrespectful and saddest F1 death of all time. It could have been easily prevented, even at that time. This was simply unacceptable, and the world started noticing. But it was going to take a lot before reaching today's safety standard, considering there wasn't even a safety car back then. It was used for the first time in 1973 at the Canadian Grand Prix, but it didn't have the smoothest of debuts. The safety car driver thought the wrong driver was leading the Grand Prix, and it took 3 hours after the race to find the true winner. Still, could be worse. In fact, one of the most how on earth was that allowed facts about the 70s was that there was no pit lane speed limiter. Nope, none at all. As you pit for fresh tires, you could attack the pit entrance as hard as you wanted, drive down the pit lane as fast as you dared, and pulled out of your box, flooring it. This was absolute insanity, but it wasn't changed until after Imola 94. There's an 80km/h limit at most tracks today, but I really can't get my mind over how dumb this was, and how it took a tragic weekend to change something so obviously dangerous. But it's better late than never, I suppose. But what about the other parts of the track? To be honest, they weren't much better. We take things like barriers and runoff areas for granted nowadays, and trust that they'll do their job to keep a driver safe if they're unlucky enough to leave the tarmac. But fans didn't always have this sort of confidence when a driver took an off-track excursion. In the 70s, it was kind of anything goes. Barriers hadn't been standardized, and neither had runoff areas. That only came after, you guessed it, Imola 94, and so did efforts in track changes to improve the most dangerous corners. This meant that the tracks of the 70s had mostly tarmac or grass runoff areas, with the occasional metal barrier for good luck. It was this that cost Francois Sauveur his life at the 1973 US Grand Prix, where he had a shockingly violent crash into the unforgiving steel. The same happened just a year later at the same track, when Helmut Koenig hit an insecurely installed Armco barrier, killing him instantly. These shoddy setups had a lot to answer for, and thankfully today we have standardized tire and Tech Pro barriers, as well as some new approaches to runoff areas. To be fair to the FIA, for once, they made serious gains in safety to get where we are today. It took way too long, but thankfully we have them now. It's taken a lot of drivers constantly pushing them to actually take action. Jackie Stewart is the driver who's done the most campaigning, and after losing 57 colleagues, yep, seriously 57 in F1, it's not hard to see why. Just look at Romain Grosjean's fireball in 2020 or Lando Norris's crash at Spa in 2021. If either happened a few decades earlier, there's no chance in hell they would have survived. I could talk about how dangerous the 70s were all day long, but there are a few other parts that stand out above all. One of the decade's most gut-wrenching moments came at the 1977 South African GP, when Tom Price and a young marshal were killed in an absolutely horrendous crash. During the race, driver Renzo Zorzi had pulled over to the side of the track as his fuel pump was failing. Two marshals saw his car on fire. The marshals went to help him, but they made a huge mistake. They ran across the track without permission, and while no flags were waving, one was holding a fire extinguisher, and with cars racing at full speed, misjudged the closing rate of the oncoming cars that were hammering it down the straight. The first marshal made it to Zonzi's stopped car, but the second wasn't as lucky. He got hit by Price at over 170 miles per hour, who obviously wasn't expecting anyone to be running across the track. The marshal, who was just 19, died in the horrific hit, and the fire extinguisher that he was carrying came flying out of his hands and struck Price on the helmet, instantly ending his life. This was a moment of absolute shock for everyone. The accident showed that F1 was still nowhere near where it needed to be in terms of safety. It was absolutely shocking to think that marshals could and would run across the track mid-race. They put themselves, the drivers, and the fans in danger. In total, 12 races were red flagged in the 70s, but unbelievably, this wasn't one of them. The problems and incidents faced in decades like the 70s are what allow F1 to be so safe today. While I see so many people talking about their frustrations with races being red flagged when it rains, that F1 is too safe now, too boring, and I do understand where you're coming from, but the reality is driver safety should always be the FIA's #1 priority. Remember, this is all just entertainment at the end of the day. None of it is worth losing your life for. It never should have taken 52 lives to get to this point, 12 of them during the 70s. And the worst part is, safety issues continued for 2 more decades. We lost the man who is considered by many, by most I'd even say, to be the true greatest of all time. After this horrific weekend in Imola, however, the world of Formula 1 truly changed for the better. If you haven't already, watch the video I made on the blackest day in Grand Prix history. And if you have, thank you for watching.